Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TCG Folk. This week I talked to Enzi Tanner, the community safety organizer at Jewish Community Action. We talk about this newly created position in such an important time in our community, his work organizing in faith communities, and his journey to Judaism on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Enzi Tanner, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you're the newest hire, the latest newest hire at Jewish Community Action. You're the new community safety organizer, and this is really funny because I had a conversation with Karen Moratz after I interviewed the previous new hire at JCA, Sarah Bucklaw, for the Who the Folk last month, and she said, I told her, I said, hey, I had this great interview with Sarah. She said, great. We have another new position that you can interview at some point too. And it's you. And we had talked before over the, I guess, early or late spring as everything was going down after George Floyd. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But I guess now that you've been at JCA for a month or so, tell us about this position and how you've sort of settled in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? Because the perfect time to be starting a new job like JCA is in the middle of an extreme election. And so the settling down, I will say, has only started happening within the last 20 days because the election kind of had things up in the air, and even actually a week after that. So I feel like now I am becoming a little bit more settled, whatever that means. I'm kind of nervous. I'm like, am I in the how long is the honeymoon stage going to last? That moment of like, what's happening. But I've been having lots of really amazing conversations with different community members around what community safety can look like. And it's settling in that is just amazing, like hearing people's concepts and ideas. And for me personally, the way I look at this is a job that allows for radical imagination beyond that what I could never have dreamed of and thought about. And so really trying to see what this looks like, having conversations with parents about what community safety looks like, because when we think about schooling, and especially within synagogues, that's our students are the most impacted, specifically now, right? Because we're not physically in the spaces. So our students who are in day schools, Hebrew school, Sunday school, they are virtually interacting. And that does provide, in some ways, a safety concern. We know that Minneapolis public schools and other school districts are dealing with this. And so in some ways, we get to have a conversation that wasn't originally thought about. Like I hadn't thought about that as a community safety until a parent approached me and it's like, yo, we need to have this conversation. This is a community safety. And then I said, of course, why would it not be within that category? Why would we? So even with that, I'm aware that in some ways I would love to get youth involved in this as well, to hear what their perspective is. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I'm excited because I'm able to look at this in a holistic approach. We're not just looking at physical safety. We're looking at mental health, spiritual safety. How do we stay safe as a community as a whole, not just what we initially think of. And I will just say one more thing real quickly. The biggest thing I'm excited about is I get to hold support groups, or not necessarily support groups, but I get to hold groups where we are addressing and examining our toxic masculinity amongst masculine-centered folks, to look at what role do we as men or masculine-centered folks play in violence and in the narrative around community safety, and how can we disrupt that amongst ourselves. And so I'm hoping to, I will be holding a few groups with Jewish men around those topics. So,
wow, that's a big mandate for this job. It's tackling a lot of, I mean, you brought up a lot of issues there that you're going to be tackling and that you've already sort of started getting into that I hadn't really thought about. And I guess that's sort of the beauty and the necessity of this position, is that you can start down the road of having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge too to know what to know what conversations to have even, right? Because we talk very broadly of community safety because it's not, each communities are different. And we know, right, that all of our communities operate differently, whether it's Shotikva or Temple Israel or Doth, or, like we all have different makeups and operate differently. And so what makes my community safe may not be the same thing that makes another community safe. And so not just looking at it holistic, but also being mindful that we're all going to need different things and create different, we're all going to need different things. And I will say, ultimately, my ultimate goal is to create networks of safety, where I don't have to worry about a friend, particularly a Jewish friend, being concerned about my mental health, calling police officers to check in on me, right? Because then hopefully we have systems in place to where there are community members who can support and check in on each other, where we don't have to, I would say that it's not necessarily about not going to the police, right? It's about going to your community, going to the folks who know you, who have your best interests at heart, who is live in your community.
And I think one of the things that we've learned certainly over the course of the, this late spring and throughout the summer is that, maybe calling the police for a mental health concern, not just in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, but nationwide, you've heard these horror stories of these people who have had some sort of mental breakdown or whatever the issue. These run-ins with police have turned deadly because, I think for a lot of reasons, but in part because the police are not equipped to best tackle that. And I think it's great that, you're going to help lead the sort of building of these networks so that people have other places to call and other places to go to when something like that happens. Mm-hmm. It's important work right now.
I mean, it is. I think perfect example is Walter Wallace. There was a mental health facility that he was a member of, right, that he had frequent less than 2 blocks from his house, or, short distance from his house. Are you familiar with the Walter Wallace situation?
Was that Rochester, New York?
That was no, that was Philadelphia. That
was
okay. The young man that was having a mental health crisis, and mom begged them not to shoot him. And that, it makes me concerned, right? Because how do we set these, even when there are things in place, it doesn't, we don't think about that. So having a community to remind us, this is here.
I mean, it's really unfortunate, you asked me and I got the city wrong, but there's been so many examples of this that have come up and have come out. Some, I know the Rochester, New York incident happened before George Floyd even, and there was a lot of suppression of that video, but there have been incidents that have happened since then that it's hard to keep some of them straight. And I certainly don't laugh because it's funny. It's sad. I mean, it's devastating. And, I think it's great that we have, there's the start of this network to do better with it. So what, in general, JCA, I mean, obviously this position is a new one, as, Karen told me. What is it about this position in this agency really specifically that has, you saw this opportunity and was like, yeah, this is what I should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, first off, JCA is I also have to say that for the last 4 or 5 years, even I don't do Facebook birthday fundraisers, but I've always done it for JCA because, I mean, Karen and I have the same birthday. That's
well, there slightly you go.
Why. But Jason, I support the mission of JCA, right? Racial and economic justice is something that I hold very dear, and I have, whether it's been involved or on the peripheral, been very involved in the work that JCA does, and I've seen the work that they do, and it has always been aligned with my values and with my missions, the way in which I operate in the world, particularly their DCC, some of their decriminalizing work and their housing work. I've been, I've been wanting to figure out how to get involved with JCA as a person who had been working in housing, and I just hadn't found the time for myself to do it. And so JCA is just such a great place, and the timing, right? I have been working with JCA around responding to the murder of George Floyd. And so I suppose the timing is all perfect, right? And that's actually why this position became available. But working within our community during that time, working with the broader Jewish community nationally around like how do we address these issues, just really resonated with me. And when the position became available, it was clear. It was okay, Enzi, you're doing this work as a social worker. You kind of like it, but this is where your passion is at. Like the top, like being able to do that is like, it's amazing. It's healing. It's it's a balance, right? When you do something that you absolutely love, it's like, okay, how do you make sure you're not working 24 hours a day? How do you not get up on Sunday night, which I do sometimes, but I've started having to track, like, how do I get up on Sunday night and get these ideas about this topic? Because this is the topic I've always been thinking of. I've always been trying to figure out this, but just hadn't thought about in a more of in an organized way. And so this is and it's a continuation of a conversation that started in 2016 with Jews of color across the country. And so this is, it's wonderful because it's not just JCA, and this isn't a position for Jews of color. I just happen to be a Jew of color doing the work. And I'm glad because there are folks across the nation doing the similar work that I could leverage and be in community with as we, and when I say folks, I mean Jews across the nation working with our community around community safety.
You said something interesting there, and I agree. It's not necessarily important to be a Jew of color in this perspective, for this position, but I do think, trying not to stereotype, obviously, but it feels like being a Jew of color, you bring a very different and needed perspective, because I would imagine being a Jew of color, you are seen as a Black man as opposed to a Jewish man more often than not, right?
I mean, it's fascinating, right? Because I wear a kippah all the time. Like, I am always, I sometimes, like, when I take a shower at night, I'm like, oh, crap, I forgot to take my kippah off. And even in those situations, right, unless I'm, especially if I'm not around, like, unless I'm around an Arabic person who's like, or a Jewish person, I get assumed to be Muslim because people see a kippah on my head. And even though it's clearly Jewish, they see me and they're like, oh, and then they default to Muslim, which is, it's whatever. It's not, it just is. And yes, I will say that it is not even just as a Jew of color, but particularly as a Black American Jew. I do have it does help. And I do have a different, whether it's because of studying or what, like there's a part of this conversation on community safety is anti-Blackness, and the role specifically that anti-Blackness have played in our policing system, even in, as we look at the history of many of our police departments were started off as slave catchers. And so understanding that history from that foundation, particularly within the Jewish community, because sometimes we know how our community sometimes be like, well, I'm not white, this doesn't impact me. And so having a conversation with anti-Blackness, I also have realized have kind of shifted that narrative, right? Because it's important and is about proximity to power. Anti-Blackness is about like the furthest away from power. Whiteness is about access to power, and we lose ourselves in the process of trying to gain that access. And so yeah, that's.
So you mentioned you're a social worker by trade. Obviously, you're doing this work now that sort of feels like a cross between, the social work aspect is certainly very important, but also with community organizing work. How did you first get into either community organizing in general, or I guess more specifically to working for JCA, sort of the faith-based community organizing?
So actually, faith-based community organizing is I've been involved in. That's the predominant level of community organizing I've ever done. So back in 2008, I did the Soul Force Equality Ride with Soul Force, which is we traveled predominantly down south with campuses that had that prevented or had policies that did not allow LGBTQ plus students to attend. And so like I actually have an arrest record from doing civil disobedience. I laugh about it, but I was actually in jail the night that I was in jail the night before Obama got elected, and I got released that morning before the election. But so my initial understanding started in from a Christian faith-based organizing, and then I did a lot of trans faith organizing as well. And so JCA just seemed natural. My understanding of organizing has always been from a faith-based standpoint, and even within the Jewish community, when I started to become involved in the community, it was in the middle of the Occupy movement, and so it just has always been a piece of me. And I wasn't as familiar about community organizers, right? When little kids are argumentative or whatever, we say you should be a lawyer instead of you should be a community organizer. You are really good at advocating for your community, right? Like advocating for what your needs are. And so I didn't know much about that because in the especially when I was in a Christian church, I just saw it as like a missionary or an activist, but not necessarily as a person. Even though I was doing the exact same work, the language wasn't there for me. So
okay. So you we talked earlier, you're from Kansas City originally. What brought you to the Twin Cities? How did you end up here?
Brought me to the Twin Cities. Long, short story. So I did mission work to Namibia, Africa, which is Southwest Africa. And the family who I did mission work with lives in West St. Paul. Asked me to be a part of their family. And that was 2014. I'm sorry, that was 2004. So 16 years ago. Oh, wow. That just, they adopted a dog right after we came back, and they named the dog Rundu, who just passed away. So I didn't realize, I'm like, oh, that's 16 years is a very long time for a dog to live. He was a great dog. But so I came to Minnesota via Namibia, Africa, in some strange,
as one does.
Right? Did not think I would stay here this long, and here I am. So
yes. Well, I think you're stuck here now.
I mean, I have a house and a husband and a community that I love. So,
So you mentioned the mission work you did. Can I ask about your path to Judaism? Is that an okay question?
Yeah, that's okay because I brought it up, right? Like,
okay.
Yeah.
So how do you go from doing that work in Christianity and go through the process of conversion to become Jewish?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer it in this way. Just like I look at it even in the way I look at my transness, right? Like it was actually pretty close in line with each other, as in one, you were born female, you're always going to be female, nothing changes. And so as I began to transition, I began to realize, oh wait, everything is not so black and white, so tangent, so not, everything's not black and white. And at this point, I stopped believing in the divinity of Christ. And so around 2010, 2011, I was just like, I'm here. I was preaching. I was at a church, and I was clear with my co-pastors where I was like, I don't believe this. I joked around at that point. I was like, I'm a pre-Nicene Creed Christian. A friend was like, you should think about becoming UU. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not interested in that. I didn't know I was interested in Judaism. I don't think I knew much about it. I preached a Black Pride sermon, and a Jewish friend, watched it with me and said, "Yo, do you want to come to services with me?" And I said, "Okay." And it was Passover, and then the next week they were like, "Do you want to go to Minyan with me?" And I was like, "Okay," and I started going to Minyan in the mornings at Shatikva, and then they moved away. And I kept going. And then I took Hebrew class, and I was in Hebrew with Rabbi Melissa Simon. And I remember this, I was in class sitting down, and I was like, I think I'm falling in love with Judaism. And then this was I think maybe a year after being at Shatikva. And it just I didn't realize, I was in community. I was wasn't even going to the church, hadn't processed that. And then at some point, I just there were rumors around that I was Jewish and all this stuff. And even I talked with the pastor last week, and was like, "Yeah, I heard that you may have been Jewish, and there was all these rumors going around. So I guess it's true." And I was like, "Well, when you heard those rumors, those were not." That was, I was like, when those rumors were out, that was completely new to me. I hadn't even realized that I was interested in Judaism. So it's a long story, and it's the path, right? Like it's more
Right.
that I see it as I chose Judaism, or I see it more of as I came into myself, becoming who I am, and realizing that throughout that process, becoming more and more alive and more, passionate about the things for our communities, etc.
I think it's funny how the grapevine knew you were Jewish before you did.
Right? I mean, I guess it's like the trans piece. Like, I mean, and even one of my friends who I semi-dated, who was Jewish, a Jewish trans guy, when I told him I was thinking about becoming Jewish, he was like, "Oh, I can finally say something." I was like, "What do you mean?" He was like, "When I met you, I already knew that you were going to become Jewish." Like, and it just took years. Like, and I knew him for years before that happened. And he was just like, the moment you said that you were going to synagogue, I was just like, "Well, it's over." Like,
well, and it's funny. I do think some of that is just the nature of the particular congregation you chose, and that it's, sure, Tikva has this well-earned, fantastic reputation of being very open and very welcoming and not judgy. And like, you come and you take it, you do it at your own pace.
I mean, that's helpful, right? Like if I mean, many of us have anxiety, right? And that's just is. And I don't know, like even at that point, because one, I wasn't sure if I was interested, but two, I don't know if Rabbi Latz would have sent me away 3 different times. I don't know if I would be the man that I am today, right? Like I have no clue if my anxiety would have been like, "Well, this ain't working."
I'll go find the next religion. Let me try something else.
I mean, although I wasn't looking for anything, but I mean, it happens, So yeah,
no, it's fascinating, and people's journeys always interest me, and I didn't want to assume that you weren't born Jewish. I actually didn't know until you mentioned that, the preaching and the missionary work, but it's interesting. It always, as somebody who's, born and raised Jewish, and I think personally takes a lot of that for granted, I'm always interested in talking and having the conversation with people who are Jews by choice, and about what led them to their journey. And I think in a lot of ways it helps me appreciate, my own Judaism more, to hear the journeys that other people go through.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I've been having conversations with, it's fascinating. I went to Southern Baptist Evangelical College, and some of my classmates have started to find me on Facebook during a time where I've been really clear, like, if you voted for Trump, you need to be off of my Facebook page, not hiding that, like. And a class friend actually found me, and we've been having lots of conversations because I did like scroll, like I looked at all of their whole entire profile before I accepted their friend request. But it's fascinating because it's evangelical. So like in Christianity, to become, the process is simple. You say a prayer, and then you're a Christian. And so explaining to her, like, it's really simple.
Really?
The altar call, that's why I like this, this conversation on manipulation around emotions, because it's an altar call. You say a prayer and it's done. And so so when I was telling her that, like, that's what they think. They think it's, you say you're Jewish. And I was like, nah, this is a year at least. Because for me, it was more than a year because I hadn't noticed it. So like, this is a year of study, and this is like not just a, which I love, right? It's not just
it's an affirmative process. Like you gotta do the work.
Yeah. And I appreciate it. Like it's wonderful. So
that's fantastic. So I should have asked you this when we were in the earlier section talking about the new job. What's it like starting a new job in the midst of the global pandemic, where you're probably not spending so much time in the office and with coworkers? How's that going?
It's weird. it's not just, it's weird, and right, starting a new job as we are going through additional shutdowns.
Right.
And so, when I first started it, it was like, okay, after the election is over with, things will be fine. We can social distance and meet and do work and different things. And it's not. I got lucky to start a job with folks who, for the most part, I already knew or I already had some type of prior relationship or community with, and so it shifts it a little bit. And doing one-on-ones with folks, with new members, it's one thing when it's people who I know.
Yeah.
And some of these people are folks who I know, but I met in the middle of a pandemic. So some of these people who I'm actually meeting with for the first time or meeting with for their work, I've never physically met. I've only met via Zoom. And so it's it's a challenge. It's fun. It's unique. It's, oh shoot, I need to set up a completely different office. It's learning new technology at as like I'm the Oregon Trail generation, right? I'm like, I grew up with encyclopedias and then I had to learn computers, which is fine if you know the computers, but like growing up poor and Oregon Trail generation means that computers are hard, meaning technology is hard. And so I would say the hardest piece is figuring out this technology piece when other people, like, I'm like, how do you send a text message from this app? That's the hard part. The rest of it is nice, especially as a person with chronic health issues. It actually has opened up doors for me to learn, and because it's a completely new career, learning opportunities is actually broader as well, because things that were local before now is now national because of online. So
I hate to admit this, but you brought it up, so I'm going to. I also grew up with Oregon Trail and encyclopedias, and I'm a child of the '80s, basically. And I have my kids explaining to me how Zoom works. It really it puts me in a not very good place.
I mean, and
I don't enjoy this.
I mean, and you're Generation X, right? Like, just
I'm okay. I'll tell you how old I am. I'm 45. Does that make me? That puts me in sort of that weird no man's land generation. I think I'm like the tail end of X, maybe.
You're solidly X.
Am I solidly X? Okay, cool.
Because it's confusing, right? So there's some numbers that say 84, 85-ish, but 84. Some says 82 and 80. But like, you were born before 80.
Yes.
So
okay.
Like the earliest one I think I've seen was 78 was the earliest I've seen. But the real, like, to me, the no man's is, well, yeah, I think the no man's is 78 to 84.
Okay.
85.
Yeah. No, then I'm 75, so I'm okay. Safely
safely
tucked in X then. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just as weird though, because of especially like you said, you're the tail end of you are still the tail end of Gen X.
Yes.
And just like, so the tail end and the tail beginning, I still don't identify as a millennial. Like, that's never going to happen.
My brother, who was born in 1980, I said, "Oh, look at that, you're a millennial." He's like, "The hell I am." He got angry. He wanted to fight me. He got angry.
I used to get really angry. Like, I used to, until I realized that, like, because for me, I'm like, wait, the people who are millennials, like, they're my coworkers who I'm 10 years older than.
Right.
Who, like, weren't even, I mean, you were in college, or in Chicago at that time. Yeah. I was going to say, who weren't even around when Columbine happened.
Yeah.
Or like, I was in the military when 9/11 happened. And so, like, it's just a different, anywho, whatever.
No, it is different when you sort of, you do that math talking to people you work with, and you're like, oh my God, you had one coworker who said to me, like, is it weird that I'm closer to your oldest kid's age than I am to you? I'm like, oh man, why would you say that? That's just rude.
Sarah, when we first did our first one-on-one, was like, oh my gosh, Enzi, you did such and such you spoke to us about 9 years ago to the, like, to my group. And I was like, Sarah, why did you just tell me that? And she was like, because I've always wanted to work with you, and now we get to work together. And I was like, thank you. And you just made me feel pretty old, because it's not like I've always been Jewish. So, like,
right. I mean, that's yeah. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, at St. Stephen's, I remember we did this, like, it was like a breaker, like a, game breaking thing. And one of the questions was, I met my husband over Twitter. And I was like, what do you mean you met your husband over Twitter? Like, I was literally doing the math, and my coworker who it wasn't her, was like, Enzi, Twitter came out in high school. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? I was out of college. And then she was like, I'm 24. And I was like, never mind. So yeah, that's the
oh man.
Yeah. So it's what it is.
It's hard working with children, isn't it? It's
well, and it's funny because as a youth worker, or my background is youth work, some of them are the age of the youth that I worked with.
Oh God.
And I don't think about it. Like I remember telling Karen, I said, Karen, I'm used to saying I'm young, because I'm used to people looking at me and saying I'm young and not actually knowing. And I'm 36, so I'm younger.
Yeah.
But I'm used to people looking at me and not knowing how old I am, especially if I'm shaved. And so I remember, like, I was like, oh, I'm young. And Karen was like, you're not young, especially compared to the rest of the coworkers. And I'm like, oh, you are correct. But most of my friends are in their 50s.
Okay.
And so that's the thing is I have friends who are 10 years older than me and friends who are younger. So all of the jazz. So
well, and leave it to Karen. If nothing else, she'll call it like she sees it.
Yeah. No, I'm like I said, I'm lucky to be working at JCA. And it's just such such an amazing community of organizers and activists, but not just within the staff and organization, but just the members. I think we just, you do all these interviews all the time. I think we have an amazing Jewish community in the Twin Cities that, we're not as big as other cities. And I think the work that we do at JCA, while we're not as big as JFRED, can easily be seen in the same light. We do some pretty amazing work.
Yeah, and JFRED, for those who don't know, is Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. But that's one of the amazing things. And when I wrote a piece earlier in the fall for JCA's 25th anniversary, and I'm always just so impressed that this, what seems like this really small organization, has been punching so far above its weight for so long and is so wildly respected in the Jewish community, not just here but nationally. It is it is an organization that is well earned national respect for the work that's been done, not just by Karen and the staff currently, but by Vic and the staff, of which Karen was a part for a long time previous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Vic is one of the first people who originally tried to get me involved in JCA, and so now I'm laughing, and especially with some of the conversations with Vic, is JCA. It's a very strong foundation of very strong leaders and people who are passionate about the work that about the work of racial and economic justice. It's beautiful. So.
And it's one of the things that I got to talk with Rachel Breen and with Frank Hornstein and with Vic about for that story is just the importance of having that Jewish voice in that space doing that work. And it's, unfortunately it's never been more important, I guess, is, I was going to go somewhere else with that thought, but the work is, we saw with, since George Floyd, since everything that's gone on in the city and nationally over the course of the last 8 months or 4 years, if you want to look at it that way, has never been more important.
Yeah. And I would say that in addition to that, because of where we're at in our Jewish community over the last 4 years, we know that anti-Semitism is real, and we've experienced an immediate threat of violence in our Jewish community. So as we're having the conversation of community safety, it actually illuminates the conversation. It makes it even a more rich conversation, because we're not saying our communities are safe, so let's get rid of this. We're saying, no, we're not safe. There are things that could potentially happen. So how do we support ourselves in community, and how do we provide a system of support for ourselves? Because, we could say for the last ever, but specifically in the last 4 years, we've seen an increase in anti-Semitism, and we've seen, we don't know that we've seen an increase in anti-Black violence. We just know that the media we've been seeing it a lot more, and so there's a need to mirror and marry the two in that conversation of. I'm just going to say, like, especially as we look at the militarization of our police forces in the United States, and we connect it to the Nazification of the German police force. Like, we have to, I think as a community, we have to be able to support ourselves and our community, and that may mean creating some new radical systems that, and I'm not, I'm not naive, not one size fits everyone. We all will have different methods, and my goal, at least in my role, is to help people learn and make informed decisions on where they fit in and how they fit in with this work of community safety. So,
well, excellent. Well, the role is I'm sure the timing of the role is never been more important for our community, but we're going to end on a much lighter note. Before we, that was pretty heavy, but we're going to end a little bit lighter. Enzi, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I used to say Purim. Is it still that? Yeah, it still is. That's actually the holiday that I decided to make the official decision to convert. It's actually funny. It was chaotic in the place, and I was just like calm during the spiel, and I have no clue how that was possible. So I love it because also I think of it as, to me, I think it is the most different holiday that we have, right? Because Yom Kippur is like business as usual in some way, like the intense retrospective. Like, it's not business as usual, and it is in the sense of it's not turned on its head. And to me, Purim is like everything is flipped on its head to be like not reverent, to be, so it just seems different. It seems flipped.
Yes. All right. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
Ooh. It's a hard one. So my favorite Jewish food, which is brisket, but I smoke my own, so I do a Kansas City style brisket. But it's still Jewish, and I'm Jewish, so I also make I have made some really good kosher style soul food, and that I love doing that. I haven't done it in a while, but yeah.
Ooh, that sounds really good.
One day, once.
If you're inviting,
I am. I'm you can hold me to it.
That and good smoked brisket. That's love that. Love that. Well, Enzi Tanner, thank you so much for joining us. Mazel tov on the new job at JCA. And one of these days, this will be done. We can, do stuff together in person, and I look forward to it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.